Autism is a complex condition with extremely varied developmental and social effects. It is defined by difficulties in communication and socialization. Today we're going to be talking mostly about high-functioning autism as opposed to the low-functioning autism. However, better phrasing would be high and low support needs. So, autism has an extremely varied presentation and etiology being the causes of a condition, the biological causes. So in the causes department, there are both genetic and environmental factors. Genetic factors are somewhat categorized, but not completely so. That are certainly there, as it runs in families, but recent research has suggested that they're not as strong as once thought. For example, in their review, Bolta et al. Found that environmental factors such as parent age, infection by certain viruses, exposure to SSRIs, and certain fatty acids all had very strong effects on presentation, and they had stated that genetic causation was likely weaker than previously thought. In addition, the difference in presentation is probably also due to different mechanisms within the body. So, a recent article reported on in Spectrum News talked about differences in neuroproliferative cells. So, they looked at some patients with autism and found in one group of patients they had a hyperproliferation, and in another group of patients there was an underproliferation of the cells. However, these opposite effects had a similar outcome as far as symptoms were concerned. This was interesting insofar as it was the same pathway, though, so progress. So, what did I mean when I said a complex presentation? Well, autism has very different symptoms in every person who is autistic. For example, many people will have sensory sensitivities. However, what sense is affected and precisely which stimuli cause issues vary by person. So some people are hypersensitive and will need to avoid stimuli. Other people are hyposensitive and will seek out stimuli, such as finding loud environments or messing with certain texture. More classical avoidance is also common for hypersensitive people. Also, stereotypical behavior like avoidance of eye contact and certain modes of play like lining up toys are, while present in many cases, are often not. This can lead to some confusion, and as a result, many people with autism are not diagnosed until adolescence or even adulthood, even though it's a it's a developmental condition. The variation in presentation is also shown in classifications of autistic people. So there are 3 different levels recognized in the DSM based on support needs, where 1 is the requiring the least support and 3 the most support. Okay, so autistic people are both affected internally and externally. Internally, autism is a deeply inseparable from the autist identity, as shown in this quote by Mr. Sinclair. It also is part of the autist identity in the sense that it affects their entire perception and way of interacting with the world. Devin Price, in his book Unmasking Autism, commented that it is characterized by a bottom-up mode of processing, which will cause people with autism to have more difficulty seeing a big picture, and they will notice very small details easily. Externally, this the effects of autism are deeply connected with how it affects social interactions. For example, autistic people are much less likely to be employed, even in the cases where they are extremely qualified, seemingly so anyway, because neurotypicals will find presumably because neurotypicals will find them unpleasant to interact with. For example, a survey done in the United Kingdom, even though it had shown that the population of autistic people in question were much less likely to be employed, even though this particular population not only had a higher proportion of master's degrees than the autistic people at large, which makes sense given that more intellectually impaired autistic people do not tend to answer surveys. This was commented on in the study. But also, this particular population had a higher proportion than the population at large in the United Kingdom, and yet employment was still suppressed. So, a lot of research in the past has tended to pathologize autism, i.e., it treats it as something purely negative and a disease state. This can sometimes cause apparent positive traits to be referred to negatively. It can also be offensive to some autistic readers. So there's been a more recent push to make research more inclusive by choosing friendlier language and including autists in the publishing process. In conclusion, and the increased awareness is really good because it reduces the impact of the high variability in presentation. So when non-autistic people are told that the person that they're interacting with is autistic and they have an idea of what autism is, it reduces stigma. But this requires that people have a good concept of what autism is, which requires some understanding of the wide variability of symptoms. This is also central to greater representation in research because historically stereotypical presentations of autism have been much easier to diagnose and are much more talked about in the literature, especially in the 2000s and before. So thank you for listening to the presentation.